Hello, thank you so much for watching our presentation today. My name is Liz O'Hare and I'm an ACE 26. I teach high school biology and physics in LA East. Mary, Alex, and Jared will introduce themselves as their parts come up in the presentation, so don't worry, you'll get to know them very well. The topic of our presentation is when the minority is the majority, effective teaching styles in predominantly ethnoracial minority classrooms. So in this presentation, we are going to focus on how we as teachers can respond and be well equipped to teach in classroom settings where the majority of our students belong to a minority population. Here's the outline for our presentation. So Alex is going to start us off by describing why we chose this topic. I'll explain some of the challenges that our ethnoracial minority students may face in the classroom. Mary will go into some broad educational practices that can be employed to address these issues. Alex will then go into specific do's and don'ts that you can bring into your classroom this fall or in the spring, we'll see. And finally, Jared is going to describe how we as teachers can prepare our students to go into a setting where the minority is once again the minority, where they're no longer the majority. So I'm going to pass it off to Alex, who will describe why we chose this topic.
Welcome everybody. My name is Alex Hernandez and I'll be taking us through our topic, inspiration. Each of us teach in primarily Latinx student bodies throughout 4 locations in California. And we found that in both the literature and in personal experience that students of color, in particular Latinx students, often find themselves as left behind or put into stereotypical roles or underserved in the general classroom. Because youth of color, Latinx youth in particular, make up larger percentages of the greater American population, increasingly, we as educators must ask ourselves how we can best support students of color.
So now let's discuss some of the challenges that our ethnoracial minority students may face in our classrooms. And I want to begin with this quote. This quote is from a woman named Berchini. It was published in Education Week Teacher in 2015. Berchini recalls her experience as a white child growing up in Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s and going to school there, and how she felt like education was completely geared toward her as a white student because her teachers were white, her mentors were white, she read texts by white people about white people. And she said, the fact of the matter is that schools were set up by people who looked like me for people who looked like me. So for somebody who doesn't look like Berchini, who's not white, it can bring this question into their mind, is education for me? Because it seems like it's not really set up for me and it's not run by people like me. So we can see this even more clearly when we look at school demographics, because over 50% of students in public schools currently are belonging to ethnoracial minorities, whereas over 80% of teachers are white. So not only are most teachers white, but they're also often ill-equipped to go into these very culturally and racially diverse settings. Not surprisingly, because there's such a high percentage of white teachers, there's also a great lack of ethnoracial minority leaders in schools. And this can have a big impact on a student's sense of belonging in the school because they don't see leaders and teachers that look like them. Now, Hughes put out a paper in 2016 that correlated student belonging and motivation. So when a student felt like they belonged in their classroom or in their school, they were much more motivated to succeed and work hard in school. That doesn't mean that just because a student feels like they don't belong, they can't succeed. It can just make it more challenging to find that motivation, which is very understandable. They also found that there is a correlation between student low motivation and sense of belonging and higher dropout rates in high school. So for our ethnoracial minority students, if they don't feel like they belonged in middle school, there's a higher chance of them dropping out in high school. And I want to point out something here about our teacher quality. So in urban settings, in urban schools, oftentimes there's higher rates of students who are coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnoracial minorities. And in these very schools, oftentimes teachers are of lower quality too. They're newer teachers, they're less trained, especially in how to deal with, or I shouldn't say deal with, especially with how to positively respond and integrate themselves into a setting that's very culturally and racially diverse. So let's look at 3 specific challenges that our ethnoracial minority students may face. And this is outlined in a paper that was released by Edinburgh last year. First is limited access to social capital or resources and educational opportunities. So social capital just describes the networks and relationships that occur between people who have shared values, and a lot of positive benefits can come from that. So our ethno-racial minority students may not feel like they have this social capital with their teachers and mentors and principals because they don't look like them, and so they don't have as much in common, at least on the surface level. Our students may also be facing different tensions at home, such as mom and dad working extra jobs. Maybe the student has to work or take care of siblings, so they don't have time to do their homework outside of school. Or if they do, they can't get the help that they need because maybe their parents don't speak English or they don't speak English well themselves. Also, maybe they have the chance to stay after school with a teacher to get extra help, but that would mean that they couldn't work. So if they needed to work or help a parent, they couldn't do that. Also, they would have to give up this critical time of social interaction with their peers, which is so important at their age. So they have this limited access to resources. Our students may also have this perceived lack of care by teachers and counselors. We know, especially second year teachers, first year teachers, you probably remember this from your own experience. Every single student wants to feel like their teacher cares about their academic and social emotional needs and can respond to them. Oftentimes, ethno-racial minority students do not feel this, especially when they have a white teacher, because their teacher looks different from them, and they may feel ostracized. They may feel like their teacher doesn't want them there and doesn't believe in them. And this paper by Edinburgh even emphasized a student who pointed out that sometimes she wouldn't even bother to try to explain her situation to her teacher, why she didn't do her homework or whatnot, because she didn't think her teacher would care. And even her teacher might call her out in front of the whole class and embarrass her. And finally is institutional oppression. So many times our ethno-racial minority students may be put on low tracking courses for no other reason than because of how they look and how they identify. And so they don't really have a chance to be able to go into regular classes, even if they're capable sometimes, because they're put on these low tracking courses and it can be very difficult to get out and get into a regular track because they don't have the support from their teachers and administration that they need. So we see this picture of this girl, Emily, on the right, and she's pink and she has her name written on her. So this just emphasizes how our students may be labeled before we even know them. This goes into how sometimes teachers can hold lower expectations for ethno-racial minority students. And I want to mention one last thing here called silencing. Silencing describes how parents and students may not be aware of academic or institutional policies that will affect them. So for example, Edinburgh describes a student who had failed several classes, and he and his mom were not aware that it was an institutional policy that students would be kicked out of the school if they had failed a certain number of classes. They weren't aware of this until they were called into the guidance counselor's office and told that this student would have to leave the school. So that is an example of silencing there. That's a pretty drastic example. So here's a summary of the challenges our ethno-racial minority students may face in the classroom. And now I'm going to pass it off to Mary, who is going to explain to us some of the broad educational strategies that can be employed to address these issues.
Thanks, Liz. The broad educational practices I'm going to discuss are school and teacher education-wide practices that can be implemented to maximize the unique gifts of students of color and combat some of the risks that these students face. The practices and strategies that we're going to discuss as most beneficial to ethno-racial minority students can be centered in moral character education. Moral character education combines two major paradigms in developmental psychology: moral development and character education. It utilizes the construction of moral values to enrich and complete pedagogical best practices and broad character education. The education qualities that make up this framework translate very well into the practices we'll be discussing today. The best pedagogical practices of constructivist learning, academic press, or school push towards higher academic goals, and communally organized schools transfer over to the teacher self-efficacy, parent involvement, and growth mindsets necessary to best minister to students of color. The goals of reducing exposure to psychosocial hazards, building competency, and building character strengths as part of broad character education align with the goals of growth mindset and resilience training, implicit bias training for students and teachers, and restorative justice practices. Finally, the work to create moral and just school communities where good learners are transformed into moral selves can be carried out in culturally responsive curricula, and the ethics of anti-racist teaching practice. Beginning with the best pedagogical practices and strategies, high teacher self-efficacy and high teacher expectations are two important ones from which many of the others can flow. So a study by Jennifer Eccles showed that a high sense of teacher efficacy, or the belief that a teacher has that they can reach all of their students, enhances students' own confidence in their ability to master academic material. And this carries over into higher student effort and higher feelings of relationships to their teachers. The same study by Eccles found that there is a higher number of teachers with low self-efficacy in schools that serve higher proportions of ethno-racial minority students. This is potentially detrimental to these students because lower teacher self-efficacy can lower student academic competence and performance as a result. A broad practice to combat these effects would be not only just to hire teachers that believe they can reach all students, which is ideal, but also to train teachers to be effective with all students so that they believe they can be. Teacher belief in their ability to reach all students can also carry over into what teachers believe their students can do, or teacher expectations. A qualitative study in 2016 found that an alarming number of teachers hold lower expectations for ethno-racial minority students. Students can tell if their teachers have low expectations of them, and this can cause them to have lower academic performance. A broad practice to work against this is training teachers to have asset-based and funds of knowledge perspectives towards their schools, communities, and students, and also training them to have mastery-oriented mindsets. These approaches are backed up by data and student accounts and are going to be touched on more by Alex and Jared later on in the presentation. Low teacher expectations of students can also trickle down to low expectations of parents. These low expectations can implicate family involvement, family values as a source of blame if students are not performing up to what the teacher believes they should be. A broad practice to work against this is to incorporate families into school communities. A study by the National Research Council showed that working with low income and single parent families reduces teachers' stereotypical views of these families. So we can conjecture that working closely with the communities of which they are part reduces prejudicial attitudes that teachers might hold, whether consciously or unconsciously, towards members of those communities. The best way to do this are events that bring parents to the school building and putting structures in place that support attendance at the event, such as babysitting and buses. Alex is going to touch on these more later in the presentation. Finally, the strategies of best pedagogical practices have many aims that are carried over into the practices of broad character education. The work to train teachers to view their students with an asset-based mindset can be carried out through implicit bias training for whole schools. More and more research shows that adjustments are needed to teacher education to cause teachers, especially white teachers, to reflect on their own position of intersecting identities, such as race, socioeconomic status, and other factors, and what biases they may hold because of these intersecting factors. A second practice as part of broad character education is restorative justice. This is a community practice where members of the community join together in conversation to hold each other accountable and find consensus. It is held up as an alternative to punitive forms of discipline and could work to prevent the over-disciplining of students of color that happens in many schools. It also can cause teachers to examine their own biases through conversation and can serve as a form of social emotional learning, which is another part of character education. Now Alex is going to take us through some more specific do's and don'ts for teachers of mostly ethno-racial minority students.
In section 4, we seek to elaborate on some of the aforementioned challenges faced by minority students in the classroom by discussing a few common but key transgressions performed by teachers against students of color. We'll then provide you with specific do's and don'ts to solve some of these issues. McKenzie and Shurik provide a quality list of teaching practices to avoid, but are often employed with students of color. These same practices are frequently critiqued in the existing literature surrounding the need for more culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. The first three practices are deficit view, racial erasure or colorblindness, and the avoidance or employment of the gaze. The fourth practice is curriculum violence, which is one that's more explored in literature of sociology, but for our purposes, we believe it fits into this module. The first is deficit view. This is the idea of the disconnect between expectations of white teachers and the realities of home life for students of color. This was mentioned a little bit earlier. Responsibilities of childcare or help with family income or businesses often force students of color or of lower socioeconomic status to put off homework or studying, which often gives the perception that they simply don't care about school to the same degree as other students or white students. It's found that students also internalize this disconnect and express a lack of trust with teachers and counselors to make an attempt to understand the reasons behind their perceived poor academic engagement. The second practice to avoid is that of racial erasure, or what Bell Hooks calls colorblindness. This follows the presumption that racism exists only as we continue to point out the differences between race. In their study of teachers' perceptions of students of color, Kaminsky and Shurek found that many teachers admitted to working towards seeing their students as white. To see white students as a standard is an incredibly problematic approach. Besides stripping away culture and ethnicity, which is a source of pride for many students, Fergus argues that colorblindness is rooted in a culture of poverty or deficiency, at which we spoke earlier. Moreover, it ignores the mammoth impact of historical systemic inequalities in terms of experiences of communities of color being denied access to education. The third practice to avoid is the avoidance or employment of the gaze. And the gaze is best understood as oversight, supervision, or accountability by administrators, fellow teachers, or parents for proper instruction by a certain teacher. Kaminsky and Shurek found that many teachers admitted to moving to schools with greater ethnic diversity and lower socioeconomic status in order to avoid the gaze or avoid that accountability that was held upon them by administrators, by involved parents, or by other teachers. This, of course, is both a product and promoter of racial bias through the deficiency lens. The fourth method to avoid is that of curriculum violence. This refers to any sort of practice or method that marginalizes the experience of students of color and trivializes experience of underrepresented communities in their trauma in a manner that's very similar to the example provided here. For more examples of what curriculum violence looks like, you can visit this Facebook page, Mapping Racial Trauma in Schools. For any teacher with any number of ethnic or racial minority student in the classroom, our top priority is to make them feel loved, cared for, and celebrated, and to do the opposite of this quote that we see here. And we can do that by going into the practices that we recommend for teaching students of color. Firstly, teachers must work to reframe their perceptions towards students and communities of color through deliberate and genuine exposure to these communities and their culture. This can be done through specific efforts to get involved within the student's mesosystem. Kaminsky and Shurek discuss the importance of neighborhood walks or home visits, even three-way conferences between the student and the parent and the teacher. The second is inclusion of that culture in the curriculum. Past scholarship proposes that students of different cultures bring with them funds of knowledge to school from their homes and communities. Essentially, representation matters. Teachers should include cultural backgrounds of students in the classroom in order to create a culture of appreciation when it comes to ethnic diversity. This can be done through oral history projects or the incorporation of books written by or about ethnic minorities. An easy way to incorporate this in our class is through multilingual prayer, but there's several examples of how to do this. Sarah Newcomer's work introduces the concept of funds of caring. Simply put, teachers should express interest and care and some sort of investment in learning from students of ethnoracial backgrounds. This can be done through a lens of inquiry, by simply asking students what they do for the holidays, what are their cultural practices for Christmas, for Easter. Aside from learning more about student backgrounds for the purpose of incorporating it into the curriculum, students of color reap the benefits of genuinely caring teachers, whether this is communicated through the provision of extra help or tutoring during lunch or after school, or by simply recognizing the power of I love you and expressing genuine care for students of color.
Thank you, Alex. My name is Jared Kaminsky, and I'm going to be wrapping up this presentation talking about when the minority once again becomes the minority after serving as the majority in the schools that we're serving in. So I'm going to be talking about the implications and strategies to prepare students for college. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at this as sort of a case study of Latinx students and their experiences as they make the transition into college and how we can prepare them. What happens with these students as they move on to post-secondary education is that they can end up in one of three environments. While they may have served as the majority in the school systems they were in from kindergarten through 12th grade, once they move on to college, they can end up in one of three situations. The first is that they end up in schools that are classified as Hispanic serving institutions with over 25% Latinx undergraduate populations. That's where they still serve as the majority. Schools with 15 to 24.9% Latinx population are categorized as emerging HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions. And then finally, the rest of the schools in the United States, which makes up about 84% of the institutions that we have less than 15% Latinx undergraduate student populations. So most of the time we're seeing these students going from schools where they find that they are the majority, and then they move on to post-secondary where they once again become the minority. So of the three outcomes, when students go on to attend a school where they maintain their own majority, they have a lot more of a positive experience for a number of different reasons that are outlined here. And these are similar to the same practices, the do's and don'ts that were discussed earlier in our presentation. Things like a positive campus climate or a positive classroom environment, academic support programs, community engagement, and family engagement. But the largest of them seems to be the motivated faculty and staff that engage with and mentor these students in appropriate ways that really help foster and guide them through their experience in college. And I think that this quote really exemplifies what is going on as it talks about the faculty and the staff, the teachers really relating to the Latinx experience while also making sure that these students are going to grow and prosper academically. While we see a lot of positive outcomes in these HSIs, the Hispanic serving institutions, when the Latinx becomes a minority once again, we see a very different outcome. While there have been general educational improvements over the years, in the past 10 years, we've actually seen a decline in the comparison between Hispanic students and non-Hispanic white students when it comes to bachelor degrees. About 30% of Hispanic students at four-year institutions receive their bachelor's degrees, and 44% of those non-Hispanic white students received their bachelor's degrees. So we still see this very large gap between the two groups in these schools where there is a Latinx minority once again. And these can be, this difference can be attributed to a lot of different things, but four of the big ones are discrimination, stereotypes, ethnic identity, and the immigrant experience, where discrimination are those actual discriminative practices that students encounter and oftentimes leave them, affecting their own resilience and their own mindset as they go through school. Stereotypes that students can identify with and kind of become either a positive outcome if it's a positive stereotype, or a very negative one if it's a negative stereotype. Ethnic identity, where students can resonate with their school culture or not, and that affects their academic outcomes, as well as the immigrant experience, which ties back into the family involvement that we talked about before, and the expectations that families and parents hold on their own students. And so what can we be doing to prepare these students for college in these situations where they might be entering a different culture than what they're used to, Well, the biggest change and the most effective change that has been found are changes in student mindset and student motivation, where students that have the ability to self-motivate not only perform better in general, but these changes have a much greater positive effect on minority students in particular. And what we see when we do this, as we shift these students towards working through mastery goals and wanting to better themselves, this idea of using a growth mindset, these students perform much better academically, both in middle school, high school, and college later on. But in addition, these changes are a serious positive effect because as children transition between school levels from middle school to high school and high school on to college, mastery goal orientations and mastery approaches, as well as growth mindsets, actually become amplified in these students. As they move on to a higher level, they are able to believe in themselves a little bit more and have a higher desire for learning, resulting in a higher academic achievement for these students. And this is something that we can implement in our own classrooms in order to help benefit these students in the future. That brings us to the end of our presentation. Here at the end, we have all of the references that we used. I'll go ahead and I'll scroll through them so that if you want, you can go back in the video, pause, take a look at the reference, and do a little bit of research on your own. And then that brings us to the end of the presentation. I want to thank you, as well as the rest of my group members want to thank you for tuning in and listening. And we are really excited to see you at the Q&A session later this week. I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy, and God bless you all.